The morning the sky bowed, I was standing in the yard with a bucket of bolts in my hand, and I dropped every last one of them. I was 62 years old that day, not a girl. I'd buried a husband, run a shop of my own, broken 3 fingers on the same hand twice. I don't spook easy, but when 400 warships come out of jump all at once over a nothing town on a nothing moon, and the light of them turns the ground silver at 10 in the morning, you drop what you're holding. Everybody did. Sibby dropped a tray of cups. Old Bram dropped his cane and didn't even reach for it. The whole town stood in the road looking up like sheep in a storm. And Emery Dunn stayed inside the shop. I want you to understand that, because it's the part nobody ever believes. Fleets don't come to Ondaway. Nothing comes to Ondaway. We're a dust ball with a bad atmosphere and one good canyon, and the only reason anybody stops here is because our fuel is cheap and our welders are honest. And that day, the entire Royal War Fleet of the Keithrai Ascendancy, a species that had been putting down human colonies like stray dogs for 200 years, parked itself in our sky in perfect formation, and the old man went right on grinding a bearing race. I banged on the shop door. I said, Emery, you need to come see this. He said without looking up, I've seen ships before. He hadn't, not like that, nobody had. But he knew. I understand that now. He'd known for 50 years that this was coming, one way or another, and he'd made his peace with both ways a long time before. So let me back up. Let me tell it the way it happened, because otherwise the ending is just noise. Kestrel Reach sat at the bottom of a canyon, and if you've never lived at the bottom of a canyon on a world with a thin, angry atmosphere, I'll tell you what it's like. It's like living inside a flute. The wind never stopped. It came off the plateau in the afternoon and dropped down the walls and made a sound in the rock chimneys that you stopped hearing after about 2 weeks and never stopped feeling. Even asleep, your bones knew. The town was maybe 400 people, most of them there because somewhere else hadn't worked out. We had a canteen, a clinic with 1 doctor and 2 machines, a Concord relay tower on the rim, and Dunn's Yard. Dunn's Yard was the reason the town existed at all. He'd bought the claim off a bankrupt survey outfit when he was 31, and he'd turned it into a full-service depot for cargo tugs, the ugly, fat, hard-working ships that hauled ore between the inner belt and the jump gate. They came and beat to hell. Coolant lines cooked. Iron sleeves burnt through. Hull plates scoured down to foil by belt dust. Dunn fixed them, and he fixed them cheap, and he fixed them right, and word gets around. The yard had 6 landing pads cut into the canyon floor, 3 arc lathes big enough to turn a drive shaft the length of a house, a gantry crane on rails, and a fuel farm at the west end. 8 spherical tanks of slush hydrogen sitting up on legs like fat white birds. There were mag jacks that could lift a 200-ton tug and hold it steady enough to shim. There was a crawler drone shed where the little 6-legged hull inspectors lived, and they'd scuttle out at dawn and go over a docked ship like ants over a dead beetle, chittering. There were 3 heat exchangers behind the machine shop that hummed in a low chord you could feel in your teeth. That was Dunn's whole world. He built it with his hands over 30 years, and he never once talked about it like it was anything. He was not a warm man. I need to say that clearly because after everything people made him into a saint and he wasn't one. He was quiet in a way that could feel like a door shutting. He ate the same meal for supper for as long as I knew him: rice, tinned fish, hot sauce. He read paper books, actual paper, hauled in at ridiculous cost, and he read them slow. He had a bad left knee from an accident before my time and he never explained it. He didn't raise his voice. In 11 years of working for him I heard him shout exactly twice, and I'll tell you about both. He had a wife once. Her name was Ilse and she died before I came, of something the clinic couldn't catch in time. There was 1 picture of her in the office, and if you asked about it, he'd answer you honestly and briefly and then go back to work, and you'd feel like you'd tracked mud on a clean floor. I came to him at 14. My father owed money to the wrong shipping combine and the way that got settled was me, signed over for 6 years of apprentice labor. That was legal out there. It's still legal a lot of places, whatever the Concord says. Dunn read my contract at his desk with the wind going in the rock, and he set it down and he said, "This says 6 years." I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "It also says I feed you and house you and teach you a trade. That part I'll do. The 6 years I'll do because the magistrate's got a copy, but you're not a piece of equipment. If you want to leave when you're 18, you tell me, and I'll find a way to make the paperwork lose you." Then he handed me a wire brush and told me to clean 40 meters of corroded conduit, and that was the whole of my welcome. I stayed 19 years. Now the child. It was the tale of the dry season, which on Ondaway means the static storms. The dust picks up a charge coming off the plateau, and by afternoon the whole sky is the color of an old bruise and the ground fizzes, and you can't run a ship in or out because the field will eat your instruments. We shut the yard on storm days. Everybody went inside and listened to it scream. I was 17. It was my 3rd year. The storm that night was the worst I'd seen. The wind gauge on the tower topped out and stayed there. We lost the west camera. Around the 2nd hour, the door alarm on the fuel farm went off, which happens. The wind gets under the inspection hatches, and Dunn got up and put on his coat and his eye shield. I said, "It'll still be there tomorrow." He said, "It's 8 tanks of slush hydrogen Tavi." He was gone 40 minutes. Long enough that I stopped pretending to read and started standing near the door. When he came back, he had something in his arms wrapped in his coat, and there was blood on his forearm that wasn't red. It was a kind of orange, thin, and it smelled, I remember this exactly, it smelled like cut grass and hot metal. I've never smelled anything like it since, and I'd know it in a second. He put the bundle down on the workbench, which tells you how out of his depth he was because Dunn's workbench was sacred. He said, "Get the lamp." I got the lamp. What was in the coat was a child. Not a human child, nothing close. The skin was a pale gray-green, and it moved not like breathing, like weather, like colors passing under ice. There was a ridge of soft cartilage running from the brow back over the skull, and it was cracked in 2 places and leaking that orange. 4 fingers on each hand, long ones, with a second joint where ours don't have one. The eyes were shut, but I could see the size of them under the lids. Big, way too big for the face. It was maybe the size of a human 6-year-old. It weighed almost nothing. Its clothing was the strangest part, this dark, fine, layered stuff, torn to ribbons, but the collar of it had a design worked in with actual metal thread. Real work. Somebody had spent real time on that garment, and then the child had been dumped in a dust storm in the middle of a canyon on a world nobody cared about. I said something stupid. I said, "Is it dead?" Dunn said, "Not yet. Get the emergency kit and the clean water and don't touch it with your bare hands. Not for its sake, for yours." That was the thing about him. Even then, with an alien child bleeding orange on his bench and a storm trying to take the roof off, he was thinking 3 steps down the line. We found the pod later at the top of the fuel farm access ramp. Not crashed. That's important. It hadn't crashed. It was a courier drop capsule, high-end, and it had come down on a controlled burn and cracked open on impact because it had been released from too low an altitude by somebody in a hurry. Inside there was a padded seat sized for a child, a nutrient dispenser, and a dead adult. Same species, older, a wound in the side that had been packed and sealed and had failed. That one had been holding the child, we figured. Held on all the way down and then didn't wake up, and the child had crawled out into a static storm and gotten maybe 80 meters before falling. There was a marker sewn into the dead one's sleeve. Dunn cut it out and looked at it a long time under the lamp. He didn't tell me what it was until much later. The child lived. That's the short version, and it doesn't do justice to the 11 days. We had no idea what we were doing. Nothing in the medical machines library had a HFY profile. We didn't even know the word HFY then. Dunn ran the blood chemistry through the machine and got a wall of red flags, and then he did the only thing he could do, which was treat it like a machine. He said, everything that lives runs on a cycle. Find the cycle. So we watched. We watched what happened to the skin color when it got cold, and when it got warm, and after we tried water on the lips. We figured out from the color weather that gray meant bad and a kind of pale blue-green meant less bad. We found out by accident that direct light hurt it, so we hung a tarp. We found out that it couldn't process our sugars at all. We got a little glucose solution into it on day 2, and the reaction nearly killed it. The crest went almost black and it convulsed for 6 minutes, and I held its shoulders down and cried like a baby. Dunn didn't panic. He said, "All right, not that." And he wrote it in a notebook, an actual paper notebook. He kept notes on that child the way he kept notes on a rebuild, date, action, result. And by day 5, he had a working theory that whatever it ate had to be low sugar, high fat, and buffered alkaline. We ended up feeding it a paste made of tinned fish, mineral oil, and antacid tablets from the clinic, and it worked. I'm not joking. The most important dietary discovery in the history of human HFY contact was fish paste and heartburn medicine in a machine shop at 3 in the morning by a man with a bad knee. On day 9, the eyes opened. I want to describe them properly. They were silver, not gray, silver, with a dark vertical slit, and there was a second lid that came across sideways when it blinked, faster than you could really see. And they were enormous, and when they landed on me, the first thing I felt was not wonder. It was shame, because there was so much fear in that face that I felt personally responsible for it, and I hadn't done a thing. It scrambled backward off the cot and got into the corner between the parts cabinet and the wall and made a sound, a sort of clicking hum, very fast, in the chest, not the throat. Dunn crouched down about 3 meters away, which was as close as his knee liked, and he put his hands flat on the floor with the palms up, and he stayed there. He didn't talk. He didn't move. 20 minutes, half an hour, the wind going in the rocks. Then he reached very slowly over to the bench, got the bowl of fish paste, set it on the floor halfway between them, and slid it across. And then he went back to work. He picked up a bearing housing and sat there on an upturned crate and worked on it with a scraper, 3 meters from a terrified alien child, for 2 hours, not looking. The bowl was empty when I came back in. That was Dunn's entire method. He never once tried to comfort that child. He just made a world where nothing bad happened, over and over, until the child worked it out on its own. We called him Nim. Him we worked out about a year in, roughly, as much as it applied. Nim came from a sound he made, a 2-note thing, low then high, that he used constantly for the first few months. We thought it was his name. It wasn't. Years later he told me it meant something like, "Where is it?" or "Which way?" and that he'd been saying it because he was lost. He was 5 years old, human equivalent, and he was saying which way, which way, which way to 2 strangers who couldn't understand him. He learned our words fast, scary fast. 6 weeks and he had 100 of them. 6 months and he was correcting my grammar, which I did not appreciate at 17. He couldn't make some of our sounds, anything with a hard B or P, because of the mouth structure, so Braska came out Vraska, and he called me that for the rest of his life. Long after he could have said it right, out of habit, or maybe just because it was ours. He called Dunn Dunn. Never anything else. Not once, not ever, and I used to think that was cold until I understood that in his language you don't put a title on the person who saved you. You say their name plain, because their name has already been made holy by the act, and adding to it would be an insult. The colors were the thing that undid me. His skin ran temperature and mood together, pale mint when he was calm, a deep sea color when he was thinking hard, a fast shimmer down the arms when he laughed. He laughed a lot once he started. He had a terrible sense of humor. He thought it was the funniest thing in the world to hide my tools. He'd move a spanner 2 meters and then stand there vibrating faintly and watch me look for it. Dunn built him a room out of the old parts annex, put in a real door and a heat mat and cut a window at the height Nim could see out of, facing east, away from the direct sun. He never made a speech about it. He just did it over 4 evenings and then said, "Your room's done." And Nim stood in the doorway of that room and didn't go in for a long time. Then he asked, and I remember the exact phrasing, because his early sentences were built strange. He said, "This room stays if I am not good." Dunn said, "It's your room. It doesn't have conditions on it." Nim said, "Everything has conditions." And Dunn said, "Not here." That's it. That's the whole conversation. And that boy walked into that room and shut the door, and we heard him making the clicking hum for about an hour, and I asked Dunn if I should go check, and he said no. Now I have to tell you about the danger, because I've made it sound like a nice story so far, and it wasn't. 2 months after he arrived, Dunn took the marker he'd cut from the dead one's sleeve up to the relay tower on the rim, and he paid the operator, a nervous man named Osprey who owed him for an engine job, to run it against the Concord registry. Quietly. No log entry. He came back down the canyon road at dusk, and he sat in the office with the light off for a long time. Then he called me in and told me. The marker was a house crest of the Keithry ascendancy. The Keithry are one of the 4 great powers of the arm. Old, enormous, and, at that time, actively hostile to humanity. There'd been the Sarette incident, and the blockade at Caldwell's Gate, and the thing at Myron Colony that I won't describe, but 40,000 people is the number. Everybody my age grew up with that number. The Keithry did not consider us people. That's not rhetoric. Their legal framework at the time literally categorized us as unclaimed biological activity. You couldn't murder a human under Keithry law any more than you could murder a weed. And the crest was not a minor house. It was one of the 9 lantern houses, which meant royal blood, which meant that the child asleep in the parts annex was a member of a ruling dynasty. And he'd been thrown out of a ship over a garbage world in a courier pod, with 1 wounded guardian. Dunn said, "That's not an accident, that's a purge." I said, "So we tell the conquered." He said, "And the conquered tells the ascendancy, because the conquered is 9/10 afraid of them and 1/10 in business with them. And then a ship comes here and finishes the job, and they don't leave witnesses, Tavi, not human ones." I said, "So what do we do?" He said, "Nothing. We do absolutely nothing forever. He's a foundling with a skin condition, and we don't take him past the canyon rim." I said, "That's not a plan." He said, "No, it's a discipline." And he stuck to it for 22 years. You want to know how you hide an alien child in a town of 400 people? You don't, that's the answer. You can't. Within a year, every adult in Kestrel Reach knew there was something living at Dunn's yard that wasn't from around here. What you do instead is you make the town complicit. Dunn did that on purpose, and he did it slow, and he did it by being the man he'd already been for 30 years. When Sibby Ferreira's canteen boiler went and she couldn't pay, Dunn fixed it and didn't invoice. When the Halloran boy got his arm caught in a winch, Dunn's crawler drones got him out in 4 minutes and Dunn drove him to the clinic himself. When the ore combine tried to buy the town's water rights out from under everybody in the 11th year, it was Dunn who found the clause and Dunn who paid the lawyer's fee to affirm 2 systems away. He never asked anybody for anything. So when people started to notice a small figure moving behind the shop windows at dusk, and when Bram's wife saw a hand with 4 fingers reach out and pull a curtain, what happened was nothing. Nothing happened. Sibby started leaving a covered dish on the yard gate every few days. Never said a word about it. Just left it. Fish mostly. She'd worked out what he could eat by asking me casual questions about my own diet, which I hadn't even noticed her doing until years later. The doctor, Vesna Aldous, came out one night when Nim had a fever and worked on him for 6 hours and then went home and wrote nothing down. Nothing. She kept it all in her head for 20 years. She used to say the only patient file she ever memorized was the only one that mattered. The relay operator, Osprey, quietly started sitting on any traffic that looked like a Keith-Rye sweep query. Just delayed it a few hours. Enough. Nobody organized this. There was no meeting. There was no oath. 400 people on a dust ball just independently decided, one at a time, that whatever the galaxy's laws said, this was not going to happen in their town. I've thought about that my whole life. People are cruel, I know that. I've seen plenty of it. But I've also seen a whole town lie to a superpower for 22 years for a child none of them had ever formally met, and neither of those facts cancels the other. Both are just true. The trouble came in pieces. It always does. The first piece was Magistrate Oral Toft. Toft was the Concord's man on Ondaway, which mostly meant stamping cargo manifests and settling disputes about water. He was not a bad man exactly. He was a small man with a large idea of the rules, and he'd wanted a better posting, and he'd been passed over twice. And by the time this story starts, he'd got it into his head that Kestrel Reach was hiding something, and that finding it would be his ticket off the moon. He came around a lot, always for a legitimate reason: safety inspection, fuel farm audit, import declaration on Dunn's paper books, which he genuinely tried to tax once. Dunn was polite to him every time, cordial even, offered him tea, let him walk wherever he wanted. That was the trick, and I only understood it later. You never refuse. The second you refuse, you've told him where to look. So Dunn let Toft walk the whole yard, every pad, every shed, and he made sure there was always something boring in the way. The parts annex, when Toft was around, was full of parts. We had a drill, 2-tone alarm on the gate, 30 seconds, Nim in the crawl space under the number 3 lathe. Dunn had built it as a cable run and then made it 40 centimeters wider than it needed to be. There was a mat in there and a light and a book. Nim spent, by my count, something like 130 hours of his childhood in that crawl space. He never once complained, not one time. He'd come out with dust on his crest and he'd say, "Is he gone?" And Dunn would say yes, and Nim would say, "Good," and go back to whatever he'd been doing. That's not a healthy childhood. I want to be honest. There's a version of this story where Dunn is a hero, and there's a version where a scared old man kept a royal child in a shed on a dust world for 2 decades. And honestly, both of those happened at the same time, and I don't think Dunn ever forgave himself for the second one, even though there was no other choice. I saw him one night, after Toft had been by twice in 1 week, sitting in the office with his hands over his face. That was the closest I ever saw him to breaking. He said to nobody, he should be running, he should have a horizon. I didn't have an answer. The second piece was The Quiet Writ. That's the translated name, and it's a good translation. The Keith-Rye royal houses maintained retrieval cadres, professional, licensed, extremely effective for exactly this kind of problem. When you purge a dynasty, you don't always get everyone. Bodies go missing. So the writ goes out and it stays out. 10 years, 50, 100. They're patient the way a glacier is patient. We knew they existed because Nim told us. He was about 11, human equivalent, and we were up on the rim at night. One of the few places Dunn let him go, in the dark, in the cold, with the whole sky open. It was the only gift he could give him. The sky. Nim was lying on his back on the rock naming stars in his own language, which he'd mostly lost but not entirely. And then he went very quiet, and the color drained out of his arms, and he said, "Dunn, if they come, don't stand in front." Dunn said, "If who comes?" And Nim said a word we couldn't pronounce, and then translated it. And then he explained, in the flat voice children use for the things that scare them most, what a retrieval cadre was, and how many there were in one, and what they were legally permitted to do to anything in the way. He was 11. He'd been 5 when they put him in that pod. Whoever loaded him into it had explained it all to him first, because they'd known they were going to die and they'd wanted him to understand. Dunn didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "How many in a cadre?" Nim said 6, sometimes 9. Dunn said, "All right." And then he started planning, not that night, but from that night. Here's the part I've never told properly, because for a long time it felt like a betrayal to say it out loud. Emery Dunn spent 11 years preparing to burn down everything he'd ever built. He did it slowly, the way he did everything, and he did it in plain sight, and none of us saw it for what it was. Year 1, after the rim conversation, he reran the vent lines from the fuel farm, said the old ones were corroded. They were, a bit. The new ones ran under the main yard on a lower grade, with dump valves that could open all 8 tanks to atmosphere in about 90 seconds. Year 3, he replaced the pad heaters with a bigger system than we needed, with the controls in the machine shop. Year 5, he had me help him lay a hardline from the office to the fuel farm master. Copper. Physical, no radio, no network, nothing anybody could cut or spoof from orbit. Year 7, he bought, at real cost, from a scrapper out of Halden, the intact atmospheric containment shell off a decommissioned mining station. He sank it around the whole West End, told everybody it was a windbreak. It was a wall to hold vapor in. Year 9, he stopped taking new debt and started paying off old. Year 10, he quietly moved the deed on the yard into a trust, with the town named as beneficiary. Year 11, he rewrote his will. I found all that out afterward. At the time, I just thought he was getting eccentric. He also, and this is the part that hurts, spent those years teaching Nim things that had nothing to do with hiding. He taught him the trade, all of it. Nim could rebuild an iron sleeve at 14. He could run the arc lathe by feel better than me, because his hands could sense heat gradients through the metal and he'd stop half a second before a cut went bad. He read every one of Dunn's paper books twice, and then read them out loud to Dunn in the evenings when Dunn's eyes started going, and they'd argue about them. Fiercely. Nim thought most human philosophy was sentimental garbage and said so, and Dunn would say, "Go on then," and they'd go at it for 2 hours. He taught him how to negotiate with a freight captain, how to write an invoice, how to spot a man who's going to skip on a bill, how to fire someone, how to apologize. I asked Dunn once why he was bothering. The boy could never leave the canyon. What was any of it for? Dunn looked at me like I'd said something obscene. He said because someday he might. Nim at 20 was, I don't know how to convey it. Adult Keithrai are tall. He came in at about 2¼ meters with that long build and the crest fully out, a hard ridge now, dark, with a kind of pearl grain in it. He moved beautifully. They all do, I've since learned. There's a smoothness in the joints that makes a human look like a puppet with tangled strings. He had a voice by then, deep, with a resonance under it from the chest chamber, and he'd learned to sing badly on purpose to annoy me. He was, in every way that mattered, from Ondaway. He had the accent. He complained about the wind like a local. He had a grudge against the number 2 lathe. He knew all the town gossip and had opinions about it. He'd never met most of the people in it, and he still had opinions about it. I want to be very clear about something. He was not grateful in the way people imagine. He didn't walk around thanking Dunn. Frankly, they fought like hell. Around his 18th year, Nim went through a stretch of about 1.5 years where he was furious all the time at everything, at the crawl space, at the tarp over the window, at the fact that his whole life fit inside one canyon. He said cruel things. I heard him say to Dunn once, "You kept me. You didn't save me." There's a difference, and you know it. Dunn took that one standing up and didn't answer. And afterward he said to me quietly, "He's not wrong." They came back around. He apologized eventually, in the worst and most Keithrai way possible, which was by fixing something Dunn had been putting off and never mentioning it. Dunn came out and found the number 2 lathe rebuilt and calibrated, and he stood there for a minute, and then went in and made 2 cups of tea and put one down next to Nim without a word, and that was the whole reconciliation. Men, doesn't matter what species. The end of the hiding started with a fuel order. That's all. A routine bulk delivery of slush hydrogen from a tanker out of the inner belt, and a discrepancy of 1,100 kilos between what we ordered and what the manifest said. Toft caught it in the audit, and Toft, being Toft, didn't come and ask. He filed a query. 1,100 kilos of consumption a human depot couldn't account for. On its own, meaningless, could be a leak, could be a bad gauge. But it went into the Concord commercial database, and the Concord commercial database was, as of about 4 years prior, cross-licensed to Ascendancy Trade Auditors, because somebody in an office 200 light years away had signed a paper about market transparency. And a retrieval cadre that had been quietly running consumption anomalies against a 22-year-old drop trajectory got a hit. That's it, that's how it happened, not betrayal, not a heroic informant, a spreadsheet. We didn't know for 9 days. Osprey knew at the tower 6 hours before we did, and he came down the canyon road in the dark in his own vehicle with his hands shaking on the wheel. He said, "There's a ship in the outer system running a search pattern, and it's not squawking Concord." Dunn said, "What is it squawking?" Osprey said, "Nothing. That's the problem. It's not squawking anything, and it came in on a vector that means it didn't use the gate." Dunn went very still, and then he said, "Thank you, Osprey, go home. Don't tell anyone you came here." Osprey said, "Emery." And Dunn said, "Go home to your wife." That night he sat all 3 of us down, me, Nim, and himself at the workbench under the good lamp with the wind going. He'd had 11 years to write the speech, and he didn't use any of it. He said, "They're here, probably 4 days out, maybe 3. It'll be a cadre, 6 or 9. They'll land on the number 1 pad because it's the only one that fits a hull that size, and they'll have a writ, and the writ will be legal everywhere except right here on my ground, and even here it's only about 80% illegal." Nim said, "I'll go to them." He said it flat. He'd clearly been holding it ready for years. He said, "If I go out and meet them at the rim, they take me and they leave. That's how a writ works. They're not here for a town. Nobody has to be involved." Dunn said, "That's not true, and you know it. They can't leave witnesses. 400 people is a witness." Nim said, "Then I'll go before they land, steal a tug. Get out to the belt, and put out a signal so they follow me off-world." And Dunn said, and this is one of the 2 times I heard him shout, "You will do no such thing." It went through the whole shop. Nim's colors went out completely, gray as ash. And Dunn put both hands flat on the bench and got himself back down and said, very quietly, "I have had 22 years to think about this. There is exactly one version where everybody lives. I need you to do what I say for about 6 hours, and then it will be over." Nim said, "What's the version?" And Dunn told us. And I said, "Emery, that's insane." And he said, "Yes." Then he did something that I still, at 79 years old, cannot think about without needing to sit down. He went into town. Walked, because his knee was bad, but he wanted the time. 2 kilometers up the canyon road in the evening with the dust blowing, and he went into Sibby Ferreira's canteen where 20 or 30 people were eating, and he stood in the doorway and took off his hat, which he never did, and he said, "I need everyone in this town to be somewhere else by Thursday." Somebody asked why. And Emery Dunn, who had never in 30 years explained himself to anybody, stood in a canteen and told 400 people the truth. All of it. The storm, the pod, the crest, the house, the purge, the writ, the ship in the outer system, the 22 years. Sibby said afterward that the room went so quiet you could hear the fryer ticking. And when he was done he said, "There are 3 cargo tugs on my pads with valid clearances and full tanks. They'll take everyone. I've already paid the captains. Go to Halden, stay 2 weeks, come back when it's finished. Nobody will blame you. Nobody should. This is not your bill." And nobody moved. For a long moment nobody moved at all. And then Bram Halloran, who was 81 and walked with a cane, and whose son still had 2 working arms because of Dunn's crawler drones, stood up in the middle of that canteen and said, "Emery, what's the boy's name?" Dunn said, "Nim." And Bram said, "No, his real one." And Dunn had to think about it, because he'd only ever heard it once years back, when Nim had told him at the rim in the dark. He said, "Anus Verin," of the house of the 9th lantern. And old Bram Halloran nodded slowly and sat back down and said, "Well, then he's ours, isn't he?" Not one person got on those tugs. Not one. The ship came down on the 4th day. It came in at dawn, out of the east with the sun behind it, and it made no sound at all. That was the thing that frightened people most. Human ships roar. This one came down the length of the canyon on a null field, 300 meters up, and the only noise was the dust it pushed ahead of itself, a low hiss along the canyon walls like something breathing in. It was black and it was wrong. Every line of it was wrong, nothing on it was straight. It looked less built than grown, and it was long, maybe 90 meters, and it settled onto the number 1 pad exactly where Dunn had said it would. I was in the machine shop. I could see the whole yard through the west window. Dunn was already outside. He'd been standing on the apron since before first light in his work coat with his hat on and his hands empty. Behind him, up on the canyon road, where he had explicitly told them not to be, about 200 people from Kestrel Reach were standing in the dust. Sibby was there. Vesna Aldous was there with her bag. Osprey was there. Bram was there in a chair his son had carried up. Nobody had a weapon. There wasn't much on Ondaway to have. Somebody had a cutting torch. Somebody had a length of pipe. A man I didn't know had brought a hunting rifle that I'm fairly sure hadn't been fired since he inherited it. Against a Keithry retrieval cadre. The hatch on that black ship opened downward like a jaw. And they came out. 9 of them. 2.5 meters each, armored in that same grown-looking material, moving in a spread I recognized from nothing I'd ever seen but understood instantly, the way you understand a predator's posture. They didn't hurry. They came down the ramp and fanned across the pad, and the morning light went over them and did not reflect. And the one in front, the tallest, walked out onto Emery Dunn's apron and stopped 4 meters from him and spoke, in accented, perfect, chilling human standard. "You are in possession of property of the 9th lantern." And Dunn, 67 years old with a bad knee, alone on his own concrete in front of 9 of them, said, "No, I'm in possession of a hydrogen depot, and you're standing on it." And that's when I saw his right hand come out of his coat pocket, and I saw what was in it, and I understood what he'd been building for 11 years.